The morning sun creeps across the eastern pasture of Willow Creek Ranch as I stand on the porch my great-grandfather built in 1923. The weathered wood beneath my boots has supported 6 generations of my family. Every inch of this 200-acre property tells a story. The ancient oak where my grandfather proposed to my grandmother, the creek bend where I learned to fish as a child, the hillside where my parents are buried beneath twin headstones. This land is not simply property. It is the physical manifestation of my family history, a living record of who we are and where we came from. I run my hand along the barn door, feeling the grooves and notches worn smooth by countless hands before mine. Inside, the beams still bear the hand-hewn marks of tools from the 1800s. My great-great-grandfather built this structure during the first years after acquiring this land, using timber harvested from the very property it stands upon. No modern building could ever capture this authenticity, this connection to the past that forms the bedrock of my identity. My morning routine has remained largely unchanged for the 15 years since I inherited the ranch. I wake before dawn, check on the small herd of heritage cattle that graze the north pasture, repair whatever needs fixing, and spend afternoons managing the organic vegetable fields that provide most of my income. The rhythm of this life flows with the seasons, planting in spring, harvesting in fall, preparing for winter, then beginning the cycle anew. There is profound peace in this consistency, in doing work that connects you directly to the earth and to those who worked it before you. The transformation around the ranch boundaries began gradually 5 years ago. First came the surveyors with their bright orange vests and high-tech equipment. Then the bulldozers, clearing ancient trees to make way for streets laid out in perfect grids. The Saddlebrook Estates development rose practically overnight. Massive homes with columns and fountains, impossibly green lawns maintained by constant irrigation, and streets named after natural features that had been destroyed to build them. Where once stood forest, now loomed 3-story houses with 4-car garages and swimming pools visible through floor-to-ceiling windows. The first knock on my door came on a Tuesday afternoon. A man in an expensive suit introduced himself as a representative of Harrington Development Group. He smiled too broadly as he explained how my charming property was now surrounded by premium real estate and offered what he called a generous compensation package to acquire my land. I declined politely but firmly, explaining that this ranch was not for sale at any price. He seemed surprised but maintained his corporate smile as he left his business card, suggesting I might reconsider once you understand the potential value. 3 more representatives visited over the next 2 months, each offering slightly more money but receiving the same answer. The final visitor was different, a woman named Victoria Harrington, who introduced herself as both the developer's wife and president of the newly formed Saddlebrook Estates Homeowners Association. She arrived in a vehicle worth more than everything I owned combined, stepping carefully across my gravel driveway in shoes that probably cost more than my monthly expenses. "What a quaint property you have," she remarked, her eyes scanning the weathered fence posts and century-old barn with poorly disguised disdain. "It must be such a burden to maintain all this history. My husband and I could liberate you from that responsibility while ensuring this land reaches its true potential." I invited her to see the original homestead documents framed in my living room, the family photos spanning 2 centuries of continuous ownership. "This land is not a burden, Mrs. Harrington. It is my heritage and my future. It is not for sale." Something flickered behind her practiced smile, a momentary hardening around her eyes that sent an involuntary chill down my spine. She nodded with exaggerated understanding, but her parting words lingered ominously in the air after her departure. "Everyone has their price. Some just take longer to discover it than others. I do hope your charming farm does not become a problem for our community. Property values are so terribly fragile, you know." As her luxury SUV disappeared down my driveway, kicking up dust that settled on my boots, I could not have known that this pleasant, if somewhat tense, conversation marked the beginning of a nightmare that would test not only my resolve to keep my ancestral home, but my very will to survive against forces I was only beginning to comprehend. The first official notice arrived 3 weeks after Victoria Harrington visited my property. A formal letter on Saddlebrook Estates HOA letterhead cited me for non-compliant fencing structures and demanded immediate rectification. I stared at the document in confusion. My property predated their development by nearly 2 centuries and shared no legal covenant with their association. A quick call to the county clerk confirmed what I already knew. They had absolutely no jurisdiction over my ranch. I filed the notice away, considering it a simple misunderstanding or perhaps an administrative error. The second notice arrived just 4 days later, this one citing excessive livestock noise disturbing community tranquility. My small herd of heritage cattle, numbering just 12 animals on 200 acres, hardly constituted a noise violation by any reasonable standard. Still, I documented the complaint and responded with a polite but firm letter explaining the historical and agricultural status of my property. What began as occasional notices soon transformed into a weekly deluge of complaints, each more absurd than the last. My barn was suddenly an unsafe structure. My century-old oak trees presented falling hazards. My gravel drive created dust pollution. Each complaint required documentation, research, and formal responses that consumed hours I would normally spend tending to the actual needs of the ranch. Early one morning, I discovered a section of my north fence cut clean through, allowing 3 of my cattle to wander onto adjacent property, coincidentally owned by the development company. The clean cuts in the metal wire suggested wire cutters, not weather damage or animal interference. I repaired the fence and installed the first of what would become many security cameras along my property line. The footage captured over the next several weeks revealed disturbing patterns. Figures moving along my property boundaries after midnight. A man in a dark jacket photographing my irrigation system. 2 individuals appearing to collect soil samples from my vegetable fields without permission. None wore identifying clothing, but their purposeful movements suggested they were not simple trespassers or curious neighbors. At the local general store, where I had shopped my entire life, conversations suddenly went quiet when I entered. Longtime acquaintances made excuses to avoid lengthy conversations. The invisible barrier of influence had begun to form around me, not yet solid, but increasingly palpable in daily interactions. "Just watch yourself with those Harrington folks," whispered Alina Jenkins, an elderly woman who had known my family for decades, as we stood in the canned goods aisle. "They did the same thing 2 counties over. My cousin lived there. Perfectly good homes suddenly finding code violations, mysterious water quality issues, anything to drive down values so they could buy cheap. Those who resisted faced worse." Before I could ask for details, her husband appeared and hurried her away with a nervous glance in my direction. I stood alone among the soup cans, the weight of her warning settling uncomfortably on my shoulders. The next day, another offer arrived by certified mail, significantly lower than the first. Attached was a document detailing every violation citation filed against my property and an estimate of legal costs should I contest them. The implication was clear. Cooperation would be rewarded, resistance would be costly. I was collecting my mail one afternoon when a luxury car pulled alongside my mailbox. The window lowered to reveal Victoria Harrington, her practiced smile in place, but not reaching her eyes. "Have you reconsidered our offer?" she asked, her voice pleasant but carrying an undercurrent of steel. "My answer remains the same," I replied, clutching the latest batch of violation notices. "This property is not for sale." Her smile disappeared entirely. "That is unfortunate. The county has become quite interested in several anonymous complaints about your property. Building code violations, environmental concerns, potential water table contamination from your farming activities. Legal disputes can become so expensive and time-consuming. Many people find it easier to simply sell rather than fight such battles." The threat hung in the air between us, naked and undisguised. "Are you threatening me, Mrs. Harrington?" I asked directly. She laughed, a sound entirely devoid of humor. "I am merely pointing out practical realities. Good day." Her car accelerated away, leaving me standing in a cloud of dust beside my mailbox, violation notices in one hand, and an increasingly clear understanding of what I was facing in the other. The quarterly Saddlebrook Estates HOA meeting was held in their newly built community center, all glass and stone, with an artificial waterfall in the lobby. I attended with a folder of documentation proving my property's exclusion from their jurisdiction. Hopping rational discourse might end the harassment. I could not have been more wrong. Victoria Harrington controlled the room masterfully, acknowledging my presence with performative courtesy before systematically portraying my ranch as a threat to everything the residents valued. My unchecked agricultural runoff endangered their children. My neglected structures reduced their property values. My resistance to community standards demonstrated disrespect for their investments. Not once did she acknowledge that my ranch predated their community by generations, or that their development had actually diverted natural water drainage onto my land, causing erosion issues I was now addressing at my own expense. The assembled homeowners looked at me with expressions ranging from suspicion to outright hostility, fully convinced by her carefully constructed narrative. I returned home that evening to find 3 certified letters waiting in my mailbox from the County Environmental Agency, Building Inspection Department, and Agricultural Commission. Each cited anonymous complaints requiring immediate and costly inspections. The pattern became unmistakably clear. This was a coordinated campaign to either force me to sell or bankrupt me through legal battles. As darkness settled over the ranch that my ancestors had defended through war, economic depression, and natural disaster, I realized I now faced a threat potentially more dangerous than any they had encountered: systematic, well-funded, and apparently backed by local authorities sworn to uphold the law. The first hard frost of winter coated the ranch in a crystalline sheen as I discovered the irrigation equipment for the spring fields completely destroyed. Pipes had been systematically cut, control systems smashed, and water lines severed, professional sabotage disguised as random vandalism. The repair estimate exceeded $20,000, money I did not have readily available after months of mounting legal expenses fighting the barrage of fabricated violations. My insurance company sent an adjuster who spent more time photographing unrelated aspects of my property than examining the actual damage. His report, delivered 3 days later, denied coverage based on property maintenance issues unrelated to criminal activity. The rejection letter bore a corporate letterhead with a subsidiary connection to Harrington Development Group, a connection I would only discover weeks later. Legal notices arrived with such frequency that I began sorting them by which agency had been manipulated into sending them. The Environmental Agency demanded soil testing at my expense after anonymous reports of chemical dumping. The building commission required structural certification of a barn that had stood for over a century. The agricultural board suddenly questioned my organic certification despite 15 years of perfect compliance. Each defense required attorney fees, expert consultations, and hours of documentation that consumed both my savings and the time I needed to actually work my land. The vegetable fields, my primary source of income, suffered from neglect as I spent days in government offices and evenings researching legal precedents instead of tending crops. Sleep became a distant memory. I would startle awake at the slightest sound, grabbing the flashlight beside my bed to patrol the property boundaries, searching for shadows that might be damaging what little I had left. The constant vigilance left deep hollows beneath my eyes and an ache in my bones that no amount of rest seemed to cure. For the first time, I began to question whether preserving this legacy was worth the physical and emotional toll it demanded. On a particularly bitter Sunday morning in January, I spotted an unfamiliar black SUV parked near my northern pasture boundary. Through binoculars, I could clearly make out a figure walking my property line, stopping occasionally to photograph or make notes. The trespasser's expensive coat and distinctive blonde hair were immediately recognizable even at a distance. Victoria Harrington had moved beyond proxy harassment to direct invasion. I drove my pickup truck along the interior fence line, anger and exhaustion fueling a confrontation I might have avoided in more measured times. Parking 50 yards away, I approached on foot, calling out as I crossed my own property. "You are trespassing on private land. Please leave immediately." Victoria turned, showing no surprise or embarrassment at being discovered. She slipped her phone into her coat pocket and straightened to her full height, designer boots incongruous against the muddy pasture. "I am documenting easement violations," she replied smoothly. "Your fence encroaches on development property by nearly 8 inches according to our surveys. That survey is incorrect and you know it. The original property markers have been verified multiple times. You need to leave now," I insisted, stopping several yards away, my breath forming clouds in the freezing air. Her smile was cold as the winter around us. Such hostility. This is precisely why the community finds your presence so concerning. A reasonable person would have accepted our fair offers rather than forcing legal confrontations they cannot possibly win. "I have broken no laws. This property has been in my family for 200 years. You have no right." "Rights," she interrupted, her voice hardening. "Rights are for those who can afford to defend them. Your sentimental attachment to this worthless dirt is becoming costly. My patience has limits." She reached into her coat, and the world seemed to slow as she withdrew a small handgun, pointing it casually but unmistakably in my direction. The morning sun glinted off the metal barrel, a surreal detail my mind registered even as shock froze me in place. "This property will be part of our development," she stated with terrifying calm. "The only question is whether you will profit from it or lose everything defending this worthless dirt." My heart hammered against my ribs as primitive survival instincts warred with disbelief. This could not be happening in broad daylight, on my own land, in a dispute over property lines. Yet the cold metal pressing against my chest as she stepped forward removed all doubt about the reality of the threat. "You have 1 week to accept our revised offer," she continued, her voice almost conversational despite the weapon in her hand. "After that, I cannot guarantee what unfortunate accidents might befall this precious family legacy of yours. Old barns burn so easily. Heritage livestock wander onto roads. Well water becomes mysteriously contaminated." She stepped back, lowering the gun but keeping it visible. Consider carefully what matters more, your misplaced pride or your survival. As she turned to walk away, some deeply buried instinct for self-preservation activated the voice recording application on my phone in my pocket. Her footsteps crunched on frozen grass as she delivered one final threat. "No one will believe you, by the way." The word of a struggling farmer against a community leader with connections throughout the county. Choose wisely. I remained rooted in place long after her vehicle disappeared down the access road, my body trembling from more than just the winter cold. When I finally managed to return to my truck, I sat behind the wheel without starting the engine, staring at the land that had sustained my family for generations, now the center of a conflict I had never imagined possible. The sheriff's deputy arrived 3 hours after my call, by which time Victoria was undoubtedly well established in some public location, with witnesses to provide an alibi. Deputy Simmons listened to my account, with an expression of professional neutrality that gradually shifted to thinly veiled skepticism. "Mrs. Harrington has already contacted the department," he explained, barely looking up from his notepad. "She reports you confronted her aggressively while she was conducting a legitimate survey of disputed boundary lines. She felt threatened and returned to her vehicle immediately." "She pulled a gun on me," I insisted, "on my property." The deputy sighed. "Mrs. Harrington is a respected community member with no criminal record. She holds proper permits for her firearm, which she states remained secured in her vehicle during the entire interaction." "I know what happened," I persisted, pulling out my phone, "and I have a recording." His interest visibly sharpened. "A recording? Let me hear it." My stomach dropped as I played the audio. The recording had captured her final threats but had apparently activated too late to document the actual gun confrontation. Without visual evidence or the most damning verbal threats, it sounded like an unpleasant but not criminal property dispute. "This is hardly conclusive," Deputy Simmons said, his tone suggesting the matter was closed. "Property disputes are civil matters unless there is clear evidence of criminal activity. I suggest you contact your attorney if you wish to pursue this further." As he drove away, the stark reality of my situation crystallized with painful clarity. Victoria Harrington's influence extended beyond the HOA and development company into local law enforcement. Traditional channels of justice would not protect me. This had escalated beyond a fight for property into something far more dangerous, a battle against corruption where my opponent controlled the system itself. That night, as I secured new locks on my doors and windows, I made a decision that would transform me from victim to adversary. If the system would not deliver justice, I would need to build a case so overwhelming that no amount of influence could suppress it. Victoria Harrington had declared war, believing her power made her untouchable. She had no idea that her greatest mistake was creating an enemy with nothing left to lose but everything to fight for. My kitchen table disappeared beneath stacks of documents as I transformed from desperate property owner to determined investigator. Fear and exhaustion gave way to a cold, focused anger that actually helped me sleep better than I had in months. Victoria Harrington had made a critical miscalculation. She had pushed me past the point of defensive reaction into offensive strategy. The county records office became my second home. Decades of property transactions, zoning applications, and development permits told a story that stretched far beyond my individual case. Harrington Development Group had acquired 17 key properties over the past 5 years, each following suspiciously similar patterns. Small businesses or family homes suddenly facing regulatory issues. Anonymous complaints triggering costly inspections. denied insurance claims. And in every case, the property sold for significantly below market value to shell companies that traced back to Harrington Development. Even more telling were the zoning changes that invariably followed these acquisitions. Land purchased as residential or agricultural suddenly reclassified as commercial or resort development, multiplying its value overnight. The timing could not be coincidental. The applications for changes often filed days after purchase, suggesting prior knowledge of approval. Social media provided another investigative avenue. Victoria's public profiles displayed carefully curated images of community leadership and philanthropy, but photos from private events revealed connections to planning commission members, county officials, and regulatory authorities that extended far beyond professional relationships. The commissioner who had signed off on 3 major Harrington rezoning applications had vacationed on the Harrington yacht. The head of the building inspection department attended the same exclusive country club, his membership dues far exceeding his government salary. My breakthrough came from an unexpected source. The local diner had always been my Saturday morning ritual, but I had abandoned it months ago when community hostility made the experience uncomfortable. Returning after weeks away, I noticed an elderly man watching me with unusual interest from a corner booth. As I paid my bill, he slipped a business card into my hand with an address in the neighboring county and a note. Information about Victoria Harrington. Tuesday, 10 a.m. Martin Edwards had once owned a thriving farm equipment business on prime commercial land in Westbrook County. His weathered face carried deep lines etched by experiences unnervingly similar to mine. Over coffee in a diner far from local eyes, he laid out a documented history that matched the Harringtons' tactics with disturbing precision. First came the code violations, he explained, pushing forward a folder of familiar-looking notices. Then equipment failures that insurance would not cover. My customers received anonymous letters questioning my business practices. The bank suddenly reviewed my loan. Within 6 months, I was nearly bankrupt. He described pressure that escalated to physical intimidation, though never directly traceable to the Harringtons themselves. Always intermediaries. Always plausible deniability. His resistance collapsed when his daughter's college scholarship was mysteriously rescinded, and his wife's employer began questioning her job performance. I sold for 40 cents on the dollar, he admitted, shame and anger mingling in his voice. 3 weeks later, the property was rezoned from commercial to resort development. 6 months after that, they broke ground on a hotel complex worth 30 times what they paid me. Martin had been gathering evidence and seeking others with similar experiences ever since, driven by a need for justice that transcended his personal loss. He provided names, dates, and patterns that matched my own situation with such precision that coincidence was impossible. This was a systematic operation refined through multiple iterations in different communities. Through public records requests, I obtained email communications between county departments that had been improperly redacted. The visible text revealed just enough to suggest coordination between regulatory agencies and private interests. References to the usual procedure and priority inspections aligned perfectly with complaint filings against my property. Martin helped arrange a meeting at a small community church 30 miles from my ranch. 12 people gathered, former business owners, retired farmers, an elderly couple, each with stories of pressure, intimidation, and eventually selling property that became part of Harrington Developments. Each had believed themselves isolated cases until now. As we compared documentation, a comprehensive picture emerged. Victoria and her husband were not simply buying properties opportunistically. They were executing a master plan to assemble land for a massive resort development spanning 3 counties, with my ranch sitting at the geographical center. County planning maps obtained by one attendee showed preliminary approval for a development that incorporated land not yet acquired, including my 200 acres. "They must have been planning this for years," observed a former hardware store owner who had sold his property after months of harassment. "Getting preliminary approvals before securing all the land is highly irregular. Someone in county government is deeply involved." The revelation explained Victoria's increasing desperation. The project timeline likely required all properties to be secured before final approvals and investor funding. My holdout threatened not just one parcel but potentially the entire development scheme. That night, I drove to the State University Library 2 hours away, searching historical records too old to be digitized. Deep in the archives section, I discovered my ranch had been placed on the State Historical Registry in 1976 after my grandfather documented its role in early settlement patterns. This designation granted special protections and restrictions against development that would alter its historical character, protections nowhere mentioned in any of the legal threats I had received. Dawn broke as I drove home, exhausted but energized by the knowledge that Victoria's carefully constructed plan had a fundamental legal weakness. My property was not simply land to be acquired through pressure tactics. It carried legal protections requiring extensive review and approval for any significant change in use, reviews that would expose the broader development scheme to public scrutiny. As the sun rose over my ancestral home, casting long shadows from the barn my great-great-grandfather had raised by hand, I realized the defender of family legacy had become something else entirely. The holder of information that could expose years of corruption and predatory business practices. Victoria Harrington still believed she was dealing with an isolated, vulnerable target. She had no idea I now possessed the pieces to dismantle her entire empire. My dining room transformed into an evidence repository as the investigation expanded from defensive documentation to proactive case building. Security cameras now covered every approach to the property, their footage backed up to secure cloud storage beyond Victoria's reach. Every interaction, every piece of mail, every official contact was meticulously recorded and cataloged chronologically, creating an undeniable pattern of coordinated harassment. Through Martin's connections, I made contact with Deputy Marshal Rivera from the neighboring county, whose jurisdiction overlapped with several previous Harrington development projects. Unlike the local deputies clearly under Victoria's influence, Rivera reviewed my evidence with professional interest unmarred by political considerations. "These names are familiar," he acknowledged, examining the documents spread across my table. "Several appear in an ongoing investigation into permit irregularities and possible corruption. I cannot share details of an active case, but your documentation could prove valuable to broader inquiries." His professional demeanor cracked momentarily as he recognized a particular name in the email chains. "How did you obtain this?" he asked, pointing to correspondence involving the Regional Planning Commissioner. "Public records request," I explained. "They attempted to redact certain portions but did so incompletely." Deputy Marshal Rivera arranged for secure transmission of my evidence to appropriate authorities, warning me to trust no one in local law enforcement or county administration. "If half of what you suspect is true, their influence runs deep. Maintain your documentation but share it only through the channels I have provided." The financial strain of this battle reached critical levels as winter gave way to spring planting season. Legal fees had depleted my savings, while property damage and time diverted to investigation had severely impacted ranch operations. With profound reluctance, I sold my grandfather's antique tractor collection and my grandmother's silver service, family treasures, but mere objects compared to the land itself. Each sacrifice strengthened my resolve rather than weakening it. Victoria had calculated that financial pressure would force capitulation. She had not accounted for the stubborn determination that had sustained my family through 2 centuries of challenges far greater than one wealthy developer's ambitions. A breakthrough came through an unexpected ally. Jennifer Chen, a junior clerk in the county records office who had quietly assisted my research, contacted me through an anonymous email account. "Internal communication you should see," read her message, with an attached image of an email from Victoria to the HOA board. The message explicitly directed selective enforcement against my property, while instructing staff to overlook minor violations by 3 specific homeowners, all former Planning Commission members who had approved earlier Harrington projects. Jennifer risked her job to provide this evidence of discriminatory enforcement, the smoking gun proving the HOA actions were not legitimate community governance, but targeted harassment. Her courage inspired similar bravery from others caught in Victoria's web, who had previously remained silent out of fear. A whistleblower from within Harrington Development provided the most damning evidence. Preliminary site plans presented to potential investors 6 months before Victoria's first visit to my property. The documents clearly showed my ranch incorporated into their resort design, with detailed renderings of luxury cabins and an equestrian center replacing my historic barn. They had never intended honest negotiation. The entire approach had been predicated on eventually forcing a sale through illegal means. Victoria grew visibly agitated as her carefully orchestrated pressure campaign showed no signs of succeeding. During a chance encounter at the county administration building, her customary composure cracked as she spotted me leaving the records office with another stack of documents. "You are making a serious mistake," she hissed, stepping uncomfortably close. "This will not end well for you." "I believe we have different definitions of ending well," I replied calmly, hyper-aware of the voice recorder active in my pocket. "How are the resort development plans progressing? Investors growing impatient with the delays." The momentary widening of her eyes confirmed my assessment had struck home. For the first time, uncertainty flashed across her face, the realization that her target had become more knowledgeable and dangerous than anticipated. The pattern of intimidation expanded beyond me to those providing assistance. Martin reported suspicious vehicles monitoring his home. Jennifer requested a transfer to a different department after her supervisor questioned her access to certain files. 3 witnesses who had agreed to provide statements about similar Harrington tactics in other communities suddenly received job offers in distant states. The most blatant attempt at suppression came when my attorney's office was broken into overnight. The intruders targeted specific case files, but overlooked digital backups secured off-site. Another miscalculation revealing both desperation and unfamiliarity with modern evidence preservation methods. After 6 months of intensive investigation and documentation, the assembled evidence formed an undeniable picture of corruption, conspiracy, and criminal intimidation, extending far beyond simple property disputes. The case encompassed documented pattern of discriminatory enforcement and targeted harassment, evidence of collusion between government officials and private development interests, financial connections between regulatory authorities and development beneficiaries, multiple instances of apparent criminal intimidation, including the armed confrontation, falsified complaints, and manufactured violations, historical documentation of similar patterns in multiple communities. With trembling hands but unwavering resolve, I signed the formal complaints that would initiate both criminal charges and a substantial civil lawsuit against Victoria Harrington, her husband, their development company, and several county officials. Deputy Marshal Rivera personally escorted the documents to appropriate state and federal authorities, bypassing local offices compromised by Harrington influence. As I watched his vehicle disappear down my driveway, I felt a curious mixture of dread and relief. The legal machinery now set in motion would expose Victoria's operation to scrutiny she had spent years avoiding. Her carefully constructed house of cards faced imminent collapse, but experience had taught me that cornered predators are at their most dangerous. The coming confrontation would determine not just the fate of my family legacy, but the future of an entire region that had suffered too long under the corruption Victoria and her allies had normalized. The county courthouse stood as an imposing monument to justice, a concept I had begun to question after months of witnessing how easily wealth and influence could corrupt its principles. Now, as spectators filled the gallery for what local media had dubbed the Ranch Rebellion, I watched Victoria Harrington enter with her team of attorneys, her expression reflecting absolute confidence in a system she had manipulated for years. She wore an immaculately tailored suit that probably cost more than my truck, her blonde hair styled perfectly, her smile acknowledging supporters as though entering a charity gala rather than a courtroom where she faced serious charges. Her legal team carried leather briefcases and exuded the practiced confidence that comes with charging $800 per hour. The visual contrast between her entourage and my single attorney could not have been more striking. Judge Elena Martinez was an unknown factor, recently appointed to the district court from a neighboring county, and presumably beyond the reach of local influence networks. Her reputation for meticulous attention to procedural detail had reportedly frustrated attorneys on both sides of previous cases. She studied the assembled parties with an inscrutable expression as proceedings began. Victoria's lead attorney opened with a masterful performance portraying his client as a community leader and visionary businesswoman, being persecuted for trying to improve the region through economic development. He dismissed my claims as the desperate fabrications of a failing rancher seeking financial windfall through frivolous litigation. The plaintiff has constructed an elaborate conspiracy theory to explain his own inability to maintain his property to basic standards, he argued smoothly. Mrs. Harrington has devoted her career to community improvement and responsible development. These outlandish accusations damage not just my client but the entire region's progress. My attorney, Sarah Johnson, lacked the oratorial flourishes of Victoria's legal team but compensated with methodical precision. Rather than responding directly to their characterizations, she simply began presenting evidence, document by document, witness by witness, building an irrefutable timeline of coordinated harassment, selective enforcement, and corrupt practices. Former property owners testified to experiences mirroring my own: sudden regulatory issues, anonymous complaints, pressure tactics increasing until selling became the only viable option. County employees described receiving priority directives regarding properties the Harringtons had targeted. Each witness added another strand to the web of evidence connecting Victoria to a systematic pattern of predatory acquisitions. Victoria maintained her composure during initial testimony, occasionally whispering to her attorneys or writing notes with a platinum pen. Her first visible crack appeared when Jennifer Chen took the stand, presenting internal HOA communications explicitly directing enforcement actions against my property, while instructing staff to ignore similar issues with properties owned by Victoria's allies. "Objection," Victoria's attorney nearly shouted. "These documents were obtained improperly and cannot be considered admissible evidence." Judge Martinez reviewed the documentation of how the records had been legally obtained through proper channels. "Objection overruled. The witness will continue." The courtroom fell completely silent as Sarah Johnson approached the evidence table. "Your Honor, we would like to present Exhibit 47. She nodded to the technical assistant, who activated a large monitor visible to the entire courtroom. The screen displayed a simple audio player interface. This recording was captured by my client during the confrontation on January 17th, when Mrs. Harrington trespassed on his property. Victoria visibly relaxed, her lips forming a slight smile. We had already played this recording during preliminary hearings, the one capturing only her final threats but missing the gun confrontation. Her attorneys had successfully argued it represented nothing more than heated words during a property dispute. What she did not know, what I had kept secret even from most of my supporters under Deputy Marshal Rivera's guidance, was that I had been wearing a hidden body camera that morning, activated the moment I spotted her vehicle. The small device concealed under my heavy winter coat had captured not just audio, but video of the entire confrontation. The courtroom watched in stunned silence as the screen showed Victoria Harrington clearly pointing a handgun at my chest while delivering her threats. The video quality was excellent, capturing both her facial expressions and the weapon with undeniable clarity. Her voice emerged from the courtroom speakers with chilling precision. "This property will be part of our development. The only question is whether you will profit from it or lose everything defending this worthless dirt." The recording continued, documenting every word of her subsequent threats about unfortunate accidents that might befall my property. Victoria's face drained of color. Her attorney leapt to his feet, desperately objecting on grounds of improper evidence submission, but Judge Martinez silenced him with a sharp gavel strike. "Counselor, this evidence was properly submitted during discovery. Your team acknowledged receipt last month. If you failed to review it thoroughly, that is not a basis for objection." The momentum shifted palpably after the video evidence. Victoria's attorneys attempted to regroup, focusing on portraying the gun incident as an isolated moment of poor judgment unrelated to the broader allegations of corruption and conspiracy. During cross-examination, Victoria's lead attorney attempted to undermine my credibility by highlighting the ranch's financial struggles. "Is it not true that your property was already facing significant financial difficulties before any interaction with my client?" he asked, packing before the witness stand where I sat. "The ranch operates on modest margins, as most family farms do," I responded evenly. "It was financially stable until the coordinated campaign of harassment began creating artificial costs and preventing normal operations." "And is it not convenient that your financial problems could be solved by a substantial lawsuit settlement?" he pressed, his tone implying opportunism rather than legitimate grievance. "If money were my motivation," I replied calmly, "I would have accepted the Harrington Development Group's original offer, which substantially exceeded the property's market value. I chose instead to honor 7 generations of my family who built this land into something more valuable than a dollar amount." My response clearly resonated with several jury members who nodded subtly. The attorney quickly changed direction, but the damage to his narrative was done. The most dramatic moment came during the trial's fourth day. James Westbrook, Victoria's business partner for over 15 years and chief financial officer of their development company, requested a private meeting with the prosecution team during lunch recess. When court reconvened, he took the stand as a hostile witness against his former ally. Victoria's expression transformed from concern to open panic as Westbrook methodically detailed years of systematic corruption, influence peddling, and illegal tactics employed to acquire properties across 3 counties. He produced internal documents showing Victoria had personally directed efforts to manufacture code violations against my ranch and several other properties targeted for acquisition. "Why are you revealing this information now?" Sarah Johnson asked him. Westbrook glanced briefly at Victoria before answering. "The federal investigation has uncovered financial transactions I cannot explain or defend. I have children and grandchildren to consider." Mrs. Harrington repeatedly assured us that our methods were aggressive but legal. The evidence presented in this courtroom makes clear that line was crossed long ago. Victoria's composure shattered entirely during closing arguments, as the judge repeatedly interrupted her attorney's statements with pointed questions that exposed logical inconsistencies. Victoria herself began writing furious notes and whispering urgently to her legal team. The controlled, confident community leader had vanished, replaced by a desperate defendant watching her carefully constructed world collapse. The jury deliberated for just 4 hours before returning their verdict, a remarkably short time considering the case's complexity. As the foreman stood to deliver their decision, Victoria straightened her spine and lifted her chin in a final attempt at dignity. On the charge of criminal intimidation with a deadly weapon, we find the defendant guilty. On the charge of conspiracy to deprive property rights, we find the defendant guilty. On the charge of filing false reports to government agencies, we find the defendant guilty. Each pronouncement fell like a physical blow. By the final guilty verdict, Victoria's designer jacket could not conceal her trembling shoulders. Judge Martinez delivered a sentence that addressed both the criminal charges and civil penalties: 5 years imprisonment, substantial financial restitution, and a permanent injunction against involvement in property development enterprises. As deputies approached to take her into custody, the stark contrast between her carefully maintained appearance and the standard-issue handcuffs encircling her wrists embodied her fall from untouchable influence to convicted criminal. Her final glance in my direction contained no remorse, only stunned disbelief that someone she had considered powerless had orchestrated her downfall. As she was led from the courtroom, I felt no joy in her destruction, only profound relief that justice, however delayed and difficult to obtain, had finally prevailed against wealth and influence that had seemed untouchable. The victory extended beyond my personal vindication. The evidence presented during Victoria's trial prompted state and federal investigations into the broader network of corruption surrounding Harrington Development Group. In the days following the verdict, 3 county officials resigned rather than face scrutiny of their connections to the company. The reckoning had only begun. The first spring after Victoria began serving her prison sentence brought renewal both literal and symbolic. Cherry blossoms adorned the ancient trees lining my driveway as I supervised repairs to the irrigation system that had been sabotaged during the height of her pressure campaign. The land seemed to exhale in relief, as though sensing the threat to its existence had finally passed. The Saddlebrook Estates community underwent dramatic restructuring in the scandal's aftermath. Emergency elections replaced the entire HOA board with homeowners committed to ethical governance and transparency. Their first official act was drafting new covenants explicitly recognizing historical properties and creating formal protections against the kind of tactics Victoria had employed. "We want to be good neighbors," explained Diane Reynolds, the newly elected HOA president, during her first visit to my property. A respectful approach preceded by a phone call requesting permission rather than an unannounced intrusion. Many of us bought homes here because we valued the character of this region, including historic properties like yours. What happened under previous leadership violated everything we believe about community. The county government experienced similar transformation. Commission meetings that once occurred in near-empty rooms with minimal public input now overflowed with engaged citizens demanding accountability from previously unchallenged officials. 3 commissioners resigned rather than face questions about their relationships with Harrington Development Group. Their replacements campaigned on platforms of transparent governance and protection of historical land use. Criminal investigations expanded beyond Victoria to include her husband, key company executives, and government officials who had facilitated their activities. The corruption proved even more extensive than my case had revealed, with evidence of similar tactics employed across multiple communities and counties spanning more than a decade. Perhaps most meaningful were the quiet reconciliations with neighbors who had been manipulated by Victoria's influence. Eleanor Jenkins, who had first warned me about the Harringtons' history, brought a homemade pie and sat on my porch for hours, sharing stories about the community before development had transformed the landscape. "Most folks were just scared," she explained, her weathered hands curled around a coffee mug. "Victoria made it clear that opposing her meant becoming a target. Watching you stand your ground gave others courage they had forgotten they possessed." Similar conversations played out dozens of times as community members stopped by to offer support, apologies, or simply to reconnect after months of artificial division. Each interaction healed another small piece of the social fabric that Victoria's tactics had deliberately frayed to isolate and pressure me. The most profound transformation came from within. The battle to save my family legacy had forced me to engage with community and governance issues I had previously avoided, content to focus on my own land and concerns. Now I understood that isolation had made not just me, but the entire region vulnerable to exploitation by those with resources and ambition, unchecked by ethical constraints. I channeled this hard-won wisdom into positive action, dedicating 10 acres of the ranch to a community agricultural education program. Local schools brought students to learn connections between land stewardship, food production, and environmental sustainability, values increasingly absent from standard education. Watching children experience their first harvest of vegetables they had planted themselves brought a different kind of fulfillment than the solitary satisfaction of traditional ranching. "My daughter talked about nothing else for days after her class visit," commented a local teacher during the program's Harvest Festival. "These children see food as something that appears in stores. Connecting them to its actual origins changes how they understand the world." On weekends, the barn that Victoria had condemned as an eyesore hosted community gatherings, music performances, craft demonstrations, storytelling events preserving local history that might otherwise be lost. The ranch transformed from an isolated holdout against development into a vibrant center of community life celebrating values that predated concrete and asphalt. Martin Edwards, whose crucial assistance had helped build the case against Victoria, became a regular visitor, eventually accepting my offer to restore his father's antique tractor as part of an historical equipment display. His knowledge of early farming techniques proved invaluable to the educational programs, creating purpose from pain that had consumed him since losing his own property to the Harringtons' tactics. One evening, as sunset painted the western sky in brilliant oranges and purples, I sat on the porch swing my great-grandparents had installed nearly a century earlier. My 12-year-old niece Sophie, previously more interested in her electronic devices than family history, asked unexpectedly about the worn initials carved into the swing's wooden armrest. "That was your great-great-grandfather Thomas," I explained, tracing the faded letters with my finger. "He carved these when the swing was new in 1927. "And he lived here too, in this same house?" she asked, her expression thoughtful as she considered time scales difficult for young minds to fully comprehend. "Yes, 7 generations of our family have lived on this land. Each added something: the barn, the stone wall, the apple orchard. Each protected it for the next generation." She was silent for a moment, absorbing this perspective of continuity across time. That lady with the gun wanted to destroy all that, just to build more houses like the ones across the road. "She saw land only as something to profit from," I replied carefully. "She did not understand that some things have value beyond money, like history, and belonging to a place across time." Sophie nodded with unexpected seriousness. "I am glad you fought her. I want to bring my kids here someday." Her simple statement embodied everything the struggle had been about. Not just preserving physical property, but maintaining connections across generations that give meaning beyond material value. As darkness settled over the ancient oak where my grandparents had once played as children, I spread a collection of family photographs across the porch table, showing Sophie the unbroken chain of stewardship that Victoria's greed and corruption could never truly comprehend. The 200-year legacy of Willow Creek Ranch continues not just as preserved buildings and acreage, but as living testimony to the enduring power of principled resistance against those who mistake wealth for righteousness and influence for impunity. The land remains what it has always been, not a commodity to be exploited, but a heritage to be honored and protected for generations, yet unborn. As fireflies began their evening dance across the pasture where my ancestors had stood against previous threats to their way of life, I realized the most valuable crop this land had ever produced was not measured in bushels or dollars, but in the courage to stand against seemingly overwhelming power when principles demanded no less. That harvest would sustain far more than one family on one piece of land. It would nourish a community's renewed understanding that justice remains possible when ordinary people find extraordinary determination to demand it.